and good evening. I'm Melisa, Idris.
And I'm Sharaad, Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Let's begin with the latest COVID-19 numbers. Malaysia reported 109 new COVID-19 cases as of noon today, which brings the total number of cases to 4,228 cases. However, there is some good news. The number of recoveries have surpassed the number of new cases for the second consecutive day. Now, Malaysia's COVID recovery rate is approximately 38%. Is this going to be enough to conclusively say that we have managed to flatten the curve? Now, to quote Director General of Health, Dr. Nur Hisham Abdullah, he said, quote, "So far, the data shows that we are still in a struggle. We haven't won and we haven't yet lost," end quote. Now, this is going to be a particularly important time as there's going to be a meeting tonight to decide whether to loosen or to further extend the MCO. Sharaad, what do you think what the expectations are with regards to the announcement tomorrow, whether we're going to be extending the MCO?
Well, Melissa, of course, expectations are or desires and hopes are essentially to return to a time that we used to know, and the old normal, as it were, and perhaps the end of the MCO for many would signal that. Though there are many, I think, false assumptions that we make when we think that we can actually return to the old ways of doing things after the MCO ends. Now, the MCO, though, period, yes, people are bracing themselves for an extension. I think that's already was in the rumor mill and was talked about on social media. The issue is, I think, Melissa, the numbers. And we on our show quote certain numbers and we don't quote other numbers. The narrative around them, that's being projected by many people depending on how they see things. So, yeah, it's a complex trade-off. We talked about the economy a lot on this show over the last week or so, and we know that that's going to play heavily on the mind of policymakers as well.
Definitely. I have to agree with you on the fact that, the numbers that we do cite on the show doesn't actually show the full picture. And I'm sure the Ministry of Health is looking at data, projections and modelling to see whether or not the curve has been flattened. But Sharaad, you mentioned the old normal, and I really like that because, we really have to brace ourselves for the new normal, regardless of what happens with the MCO, whether it's loosened or it's extended. The truth is we have to get used to maintaining a strict physical distancing approach as part of our lifestyle. This is going to be a long-term thing. We have to get used to wearing masks. It's going to change the nature of our social lives. Think of birthday parties and gatherings. It's going to change the nature of our religious lives. The way we work is going to change. I'm thinking about Ramadan, what's going to happen during Ramadan, what's going to happen during the Raya period.
Easter is coming up as well. And so for Christians, this is also a very important moment in their calendar.
To congregate, right? And it's our nature to want to congregate.
And also travel. And, what's going to happen to our borders? We talked about Indonesia. The Sarawak government has, just announced that it's going to tighten controls over its very, very long border with Indonesia. Is that going to be sufficient? And, if we do well in Malaysia, if our neighbors don't do well, that's a problem for us too. And we're not in control of those contexts. So what do we do with a world that's very, very complex in terms of the landscape of managing this particular pandemic?
So just to manage expectation, folks, regardless what happens with the announcement of the MCO tomorrow, we have to embrace this new normal as a long-term lifestyle, and it's going to change the way we live. All right, well, let's move on to some other news. Higher Education Minister Nuraini Ahmad caused a bit of a stir after announcing a TikTok competition yesterday. She posted on Twitter that she was creating a TikTok contest for Malaysians to join and win a prize. However, there's been significant backlash online, after which the social media posts promoting it were then removed.
Well, Melissa, the mockery that, of course, the minister quoted in this particular instance is there for all to see. And I think it's become far too easy to mock our politicians, some of whom seem ill-suited for the job.
Right.
Nevertheless, when it comes to the question of higher education, Melissa, I think that the ministry and the politicians are only one of many stakeholders. Sure. And the important conversations that need to be happening can still happen, even if they are focused on other things.
Can I just break it down, though? I mean, when we take a look at the backlash that happened online, I'm sure you saw some of the, the comments that were made. What specifically were the objections that you noticed, Sharaad? I saw most of the comments being, the objections to this TikTok competition was really around the fact that this is really not a time for frivolity. This is not, a time to be thinking about making videos, given that there are serious considerations in the way we have to live our lives post-pandemic, right?
Yeah, so, okay, keeping people entertained or helping them understand how they might keep themselves entertained or, during this period is one strategy. And I think politicians perhaps thinking about their constituents in terms of voters and how they might give something to them. But I think the issue was whether it was suitable for the Ministry of Higher Education to be promoting this particular platform, a platform that's seen as catering to actually very young people, in their tweens and teens, rather than people thinking about higher education, where we associate that with the pursuit of knowledge, with reading, with deeper exploration of the world and, and such. And so, the former Minister of Education, put out a tweet talking about the many online courses from Ivy League universities that one can, in fact, access during this period.
That
seems a bit more in keeping with the issue of higher education.
Yes.
But like Melisa, I said, well, let's leave the politicians side, because some of them just seem to have their own ideas on what they want to do, and, whatever they're being paid through the public purse aside, the important thing is we must not lose sight to the fact of, what has been the role of universities, public and private, in this particular crisis? What will happen to the foreign student population after the MCO is lifted? What's happened to them now? What is the experience of online education? Is it all that it's cracked up to be, or are there serious problems with that?
Yes.
So, can that be a real template for the future? These are the important conversations for higher education, whether the higher education minister wants to lead that conversation or not.
Well, definitely true. We have to think about efforts to address our higher education, especially post-MCO and during a time of COVID-19. Online learning, as you mentioned, online classes, whether that is actually the best way forward, and, perhaps looking at reshaping the curriculum in all. Some of the things that we should consider. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and after this, we're going to take a closer look at the legal considerations in enforcing the MCO. Stay tuned to consider this.
Itulah bukan nak benda lah, tapi seronoklah duduk rumah ya, fikir positif. InsyaAllah kita doakan supaya COVID ni habis cepat. Itu pasal. Dan satu lagi, kalau setting dia tak cakap lemah macam ni, dia cakap lemah lembut. Katanya, yalah baiklah pada semua duduk kat rumah.
I'm Melisa Idris, with me Sharaad Kuttan. In enforcing the movement control order, law enforcement officers are also at the front lines. They're exposing themselves to the risk of being infected by COVID-19. So far, more than 7,000 people have been arrested for violating the MCO since its inception. And this is despite authorities announcing that the compliance rate is now at 97%. Well, to help us understand the legal limitations of enforcement of the MCO, we have joining us on the line now lawyer Syahredzan Johan. Shah, thank you for joining us this evening. Now,
hi, thanks for having me.
If you could begin by laying out what the factors are for one to be considered in breach of the MCO. What do you have to do to be considered contravening the order?
Well, basically the MCO regulations, there's thus far 2 regulations. Number 2 is for the second phase, and it replaces number 1. And these regulations are made pursuant to the Prevention and Control of Infectious Disease Act. And in the regulation, it says that any person who contravenes any provisions of the regulations or any directions of the Director General or any authorized officer commits an offence, and shall, upon conviction, be liable to a fine of not exceeding 1,000 ringgit or a term of imprisonment not exceeding 6 months or both. So basically what you have to do to be in contravention is for you to not follow any of the provisions of the regulations or any of the direction of the DG. So, for example, if you assemble or if you actually gather, which according to regulation number 6 is prohibited, where it says that no person shall gather or be involved in any gathering, whether it's for religious, sports or recreational activities. If you gather, a group of you gather, then what will happen is that you would be in breach of the MCO, the MCO regulation number 2, and action can be taken against you. Now, there is a quite an interesting point here in the fact that the police cannot actually arrest you on the basis that you have breached the MCO order, because they would require a warrant to do so. So, because breach of the MCO order is actually not a seizable offence, where a police officer can actually make an arrest without a warrant, because of the fact that the maximum, as mentioned by the regulation, is only imprisonment up to 6 months. So they would need a warrant, but usually most of the time it'll be a bit late for you to go get a warrant. So what I've found out is that they have been using another law, which is the Penal Code, under Section 186, which is obstruction of a public officer in the execution of his duty, to actually make the arrest. So they make the arrest under Section 186 of the Penal Code, and then later on they charge under the MCO regulations, under the Act, and perhaps in certain circumstances what they will do is they will also charge, if it becomes if the so-called obstruction is too obvious or too forceful, they might also charge the person under Section 186.
Shah, in your opinion, is that okay process-wise? Is there something wrong with the police using the penal code but eventually charging people under MCO? I mean, is there a problem there?
I think there is a problem, and I think what they have done now is much better, which is now we have heard that they have started issuing compounds instead of arresting people and charging them. So that is a much better approach. Really, I think the focus shouldn't be on punishing people. It should be to ensure compliance, and ensuring compliance can be done without these penal sanctions. Right. So what they're doing now is, I think, a much better option, and we really don't want people being arrested, putting it in lockups, and then later on be charged and sentenced to jail. And in fact, I believe the Prisons Department Director have also came up with a statement saying that asking the courts not to send offenders of the MCO to jail. So I think all this considered, it's a good development.
Well, Shah, you mentioned the Prevention and Control of Infectious Diseases Act, right? Used under the MCO, and I'm wondering whether that act actually empowers enforcement officers to use force. Are they allowed to, cane offenders, make offenders do squats, for example?
No. The act is actually silent in terms of what these authorities, especially the police, can do. So we have to fall back to the penal code, the criminal procedure code, which sets out the powers of the police, and of course also the Police Act. And certainly when you talk about arrests and all that, it talks, the criminal procedure code talks about reasonable force in order to make an arrest and so on. So
what's reasonable force, Shah? What's reasonable force?
Well, reasonable force is just basically anything which is necessary at that particular point in time to ensure that the person arrested is complying with the arrest and is not struggling or fighting back. So you cannot use excessive force. You cannot, for example, you certainly can't cane them, especially if they've already been sitting. I think that you're making reference to a video where
That's right.
I think a few offenders were already sitting down and the police was caning them. Certainly, this is not allowed either under the MCO or the Act or even the Criminal Procedure Code. So that is not reasonable force. Reasonable force is if, say, for example, you're trying to arrest someone and they struggle or they resist arrest, then you may use reasonable force. But once you apprehend the person, he doesn't struggle anymore. You cannot like steal a few punches or a few slaps or a few kicks to the person. That would not be the use of reasonable force.
And there's probably not even something that you wanted to do before the MCO was announced. In the last half a minute or so that we have, Shah, your sense of how the criminal justice system is going to change because of this emphasis that we have on social distancing now during the MCO, but also after?
I think we need to start looking at other forms of punishment instead of imprisonment. We do have provisions for community service, for example, but it's not being used as often as a lot of people would like. So I think instead of sending people to jail, especially for more minor offences, I think we need to start looking at these other forms of punishment in light of the fact that, you know, we don't want the prisons to be overcrowded. COVID-19 is still going to be an issue for the at least next 6 to even a year. 6 months to even a year. So we need to look at these new forms of punishment. And I really do think that the government needs to relook at a lot of our laws, which are now perhaps need to be reconsidered. I think Singapore, for example, has been looking at the contractual relationship between persons, and although we're talking about the criminal justice system here, but I think a more comprehensive review of the laws that we have post the MCO and in the time of COVID needs to be looked at, because we're talking about a new normal here. There's not going to be the same old normal that we know previously.
That's right. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight and helping us through the legal limitations of the MCO. Appreciate your time tonight. We're going to take a quick break on Consider This. After this, we're going to take a closer look at how the MCO has posed an unforeseen constitutional dilemma for state governments. So stay tuned. Thank you for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. Under state constitutions, all state governments must convene not later than 6 months from their last sitting. Now, for some assemblies, that date expires either this month or in May. Now, the MCO, it seems, has posed an unforeseen constitutional dilemma for state governments. Should state assemblies still meet, regardless of the MCO? Joining us on the line now to give a better understanding of the situation, we have former law professor Gurdial Singh, president of the National Human Rights Society, or better known as HAKAM. Gurdial, good evening. Thank you for coming on the show tonight.
Hello.
You know, you've been quoted as saying that state assemblies must continue to hold their meetings or risk undermining the role of separation of powers and, in fact, the entire democratic process. Now, I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that. What did you mean by that?
Well, the provision in the federal constitution is very clear. It requires the convening of a meeting within 6 months from the last session. And that's a federal edict, if you call it that, and therefore it has to be adhered to. There is no extenuating circumstance that is written into the Constitution excusing or allowing for the delay of this particular provision. In other words, this provision is mandatory, it has to be complied with, and if it is not complied with, then it's a violation of the Constitution.
So just to get this right, this is under the federal constitution as well as state constitutions, right?
Yes, the federal constitution, there's Article 55, which requires that. But there's also a provision in the federal constitution which says that all state constitutions must include in their state constitution certain provisions. And this is one of the provision which is mandatory also for state constitutions to incorporate in their state constitution. So all state constitutions have this provision.
Okay.
Could you explain to us why this is so? I mean, why shouldn't the executive be allowed to negotiate the question of the sitting, whether it's a federal parliament or state assemblies?
Well, generally speaking, you can prorogue, which means you can adjourn or have a complete adjournment of the proceedings itself. All right, you can adjourn or you can prorogue, discontinue. But there is a requirement that there cannot be more than 6 months from the last session sitting. Now, there is a reason for that, because the government must always allow for the legislature, the legislative assembly, because these are the people's representatives who have been voted, and they must have all issues that need to be discussed by the legislature itself, and then they can decide on the passing of any resolutions or the discussion of any bills or acts that the Parliament wants to introduce in the Dewan Rakyat.
Okay.
So this is a very critical part, of the separation of powers between the government and the legislator. And it's also a critical part of allowing as a foundation of parliamentary government, to allow people's representatives to discuss issues that are critical to the nation. And you cannot just simply allow the executive, the government, to keep postponing this and defeat this whole foundational basis of a democracy.
Well, Gurdial, isn't the MCO, isn't the Movement Control Order enough to postpone any sittings outside the 6-month date?
My short answer is that it is not a good enough reason unless there is a calamity of a major proportion which prevents the convening of a meeting. Now, the convening MCO cannot be used as a basis to defer the convening of the meeting in the light of this mandatory provision, because if you do that, then you can keep postponing the discussion of matters that require national attention through the representatives of the people itself who have voted them in. So, in short, you cannot postpone unless it is impossible to convene. Now, here, it is not impossible to convene. How you best deal with it, of course, it will depend upon, how the House and the Speaker can arrange for something that is not hazardous and will provide for an accommodation of the infectious disease spreading problem.
Gurdial, one of the things, of course, is that around the discussion of the MCO is the discourse of, of a crisis, right? That this is a war. And, there is, in fact, kind of subtle references to warlike situations where we imagine, many basic rights can be suspended. Think of the Constitution being suspended because of the war. Is this pandemic analogous to a war situation which would result in the Constitution being somehow held in abeyance in order to resolve the warlike situation?
Well, the word war has been used, but there is no war as such that disallows the exercise of the fundamental freedoms that are enshrined in the Constitution and for provisions of the Constitution to be implemented. So it is a figurative, this is a figure of speech that it is a war and therefore it requires measures. But unless you can show that the country is is disabled to the extent that it cannot function at all unless you have a special operational government executive to run the process, then you have to allow the constitutional provisions to continue to apply. In other words, whatever you do to deal with this pandemic, which is, of course, unusual, has to be done consistently with the provisions of the Constitution.
Okay. All right. So you're saying there really is no excuse not to have a parliament sitting or for state assemblies to meet. So how would that look like in the era of physical and social distancing, Gurdial, in the 1 minute that we have left?
Yes. You see, you look at other countries, Singapore, for example. Now, what they've done is they have put in place, so the first reading was on 7th of April. They put in place COVID-19 temporary measures bill, in which they actually provide that where meetings have to be convened and which require personal attendance, as Parliament and the state assemblies require, then there are various ways in which you can deal with it electronically. You can ask questions through electronic means. You can have those answered. Even voting can be done through the electronic media.
Right.
So the fact is that you can make provisions to accommodate, but you have to anchor this in legal provisions if you want to avoid violating the Constitution itself. You cannot just announce over the radio that this is going to happen or we are going to defer Parliament or state assemblies because that is what the executive feels. They can't do that because of the mandatory provision in the Constitution itself, which requires you to convene a meeting, which means convene a meeting which requires the members of Parliament or the aduns to actually physically attend, unless there's a provision that's made to the contrary. And so far, we have not done what Singapore has done to provide for this alternative means of conducting meetings.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have on the show for this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris with me, Sharaad Kuttan, signing off. Thank you so much for watching and good night.